Welcome back, friends. I'm joined today by Chris Sanders of Design Realty, one of my colleagues. Thank you, Chris, for joining.
Thanks for having me.
And we are going to talk about bidding wars on the buyer side. How do buyers stand out? Obviously, I think you and I have a lot of thoughts on this.
Yeah.
And we could and do teach a 2 hour, hour and a half class on how to be a good buyer in a difficult market. So I obviously would encourage folks to sign up for that. But in the meantime, let's dive into some, shall we say, brief details.
Yeah. Let's.
So we've got a list here of kind of questions, but I think most of them just really kind of go through the offer as far as like what we can do for terms. First things first, and probably where most buyers should start first, is their financing. What's your advice to your clients when it comes to getting ready for their financing? Obviously, if they're cash, just have your money ready. But yeah, what are your thoughts on financing?
I have a lot of thoughts. I would love to start off with an overlay saying specifically in the greater Seattle area, and right now in the springtime, it is competitive. And that's just the way it is. Don't let competitive bidding situations steer you away from offering a house.
Right.
You never know if they're going to get 1 offer or 10 offers. And worst case, especially if you're newer to the buying real estate game, start throwing them out. It'll give you a lay of the landscape, show you how the offer process works. But back into financing, super important. So I'm sure we'll talk about it later on, but pre-qualification versus pre-approval. First of all, if you have a pre-qual letter, it's not worth the PDF it was sent in. That's essentially just you telling that lender, hey, I make $1 million a year. I have $5 million cash. How much house can I afford? They say you're good for $10 million.
Right.
What you need is an actual pre-approval letter, and preferably a pre-approval letter from a reputable and well-known lender in the market.
Yes.
So like, I know we have a handful of lenders that we both work with. I have mine, you have a couple of yours, and we choose them for a couple different reasons. One of the big reasons we use them is because their local reputation.
Yeah.
I get 2 offers, apples to apples. One's with a lender that I don't like very much for specific reasons, and one that I do like. I am 100% recommending the lender that I know is going to get the loan closed.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, especially when looking at what a seller wants, the listing agent, one of the first things they're doing is looking at the financing. I mean, first thing I do is look at the purchase price on the offer. And second thing I do is look at who the lender is. And good lenders that we know, honestly, I don't even feel the need to talk to them most of the time because I know that, if I've worked with that lender before, I know that this person is vetted. On the other hand, if it's, somebody on the East Coast, I've never heard of them. Maybe it's a big bank. I don't know. It could be some fly-by-night company. It doesn't really matter. In those cases, yeah, it's huge because I'm calling and I want to know what have they done. I'm going to kind of grill them a bit, make sure that they've actually vetted these folks.
Yeah. I had that exact scenario where I had some buyers who saw a house at 2 p.m. on a Friday, and they were with one of the big, well-known predatory VA lenders over on the East Coast. So we're all standing there in a circle, and the buyers tell me, hey, I want to write an offer. So I said, cool, let's call up your lender and get a pre-approval letter so we can submit that offer tonight. We call them on speakerphone and go, hey, we need a pre-approval letter at $550,000. This lender at 2 p.m. our time goes, I'm clocking out in 15 minutes. I don't work this weekend. I'll call you back 9 a.m. Monday. And at that point, my buyers went, you're absolutely right. Let's go with the trusted local lender that'll actually give us the letter. And they did. And they ended up closing and getting that house.
Amazing. Amazing what a difference that can make. And then, as far as, like you said, pre-qualification is just garbage. Approval is at least the minimum standard. At least that way they've done some kind of credit pull. They've verified that you actually have money. It's not just you telling them. It's not just, do you have a pulse? And then, of course, the third step, when it makes sense, is pre-underwriting, which is, where the buyer is fully vetted. All that's got to be plugged in at that point is the house appraisal and make sure everything is good there. But that buyer, unless something drastic happens, like losing a job or unless they intentionally do something like spending all their money, it's as good as close to cash as you can get without being cash, basically. So yeah, I think probably they're pretty basic steps, like the getting your financing in order, but I think they're the most concrete ones. Like it's almost the foundation you have to build off of. If you don't have that, nothing else really matters. There's no point having the conversation.
It's so often overlooked.
It is.
They'll find the perfect house and get pre-approved after they found it.
Yeah.
It almost never works out, especially in today's market.
Well, and I think a lot of buyers, at least in my experience, a lot of buyers think that we can do it. They go, if they haven't gotten into it and they're just getting started, they think I go find the home, I talk to my agent gets me pre-approved, or can do it. It's almost like like a couple of clicks, like the car loan. I mean, you walk in a car dealership and you can be out in 20 minutes if you really push it. And I think that experience might be where some folks get the idea from, but it's just not that way. Pre-approval, you should at least give yourself 24 hours if you can. Actually, like you said, our lenders can do them sometimes in a couple hours, but ideally you should do it early. Giving yourself more time that, sometimes you got to find investment stuff like that. And if you don't have that all ready, then your approval might not be as high as it could be too.
Yeah. And even outside of that, outside of like the competitive before you find the house, I've had multiple scenarios where the clients go out, they find a home they love and they go to get pre-qualified and then pre-approved. And it turns out they can't afford it.
Yeah.
Whether it's $5,000 or $50,000, whatever the number is. There have been very few scenarios where I've seen clients more heartbroken than that. And that sucks for me as the agent. I don't mind going out and showing them houses, even if they're not quite fully pre-approved yet. But as soon as the number comes in, you can't afford it. That's so hard.
And then you're having to redirect the search. And once you're emotionally set on this is the kind of house I want, and suddenly I can't get a single family home, I'd have to go into a townhome range or something like that. That changes everything. Definitely the most important thing. And then let's talk about just some contingencies. We'll talk about the escalation in a minute, and we'll talk about earnest money, but let's just talk about some contingencies.
Yeah.
We've got a few that are pretty standard. Obviously, your financing contingency, which contains the appraisal, and then your inspection. And then there's some other various ones like your title contingency. With the inspection, we talked a little bit on another episode about pre-inspections. If a seller's done a pre-inspection, what are your thoughts on those?
I like them. But I like my clients to include an inspection contingency more. If for whatever reason the situation is so competitive that we can't get an offer with an inspection contingency accepted, which is more common than a lot of people realize, we want to at least do our own pre-inspection, in my opinion.
Right.
If the seller will let us for a pre-inspection, we'll sign a little form giving us permission to go in the house. We'll conduct a full inspection and kind of just gives us an idea of what's going on with the home. We can't renegotiate based off of our findings, but we can decide what's offered based on what our inspector finds.
Going into it with eyes wide open,
totally
knowing what's going on.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And if there's an offer review, generally you have a few days. And, when full-time brokers like us, we generally have an inspector in our pocket. Rarely can I not get an inspection even the next day if I need to.
Yeah.
We can almost always make it happen. In fact, I've even had times where I write the full offer and have it sitting there, and our inspection wraps up an hour before the review deadline, and all we got to do is sign, send. We just want to know if the house isn't falling apart. But I agree. I think that you have to be competitive in some way, and doing re-inspection is the way to do it. Waive an inspection, that is what's called for, and that makes me uncomfortable.
It also depends on the clients, too.
It does.
So first-time home buyers, VA, 0% down, they don't have a lot of liquidity to fix if they were to come up. I would be very, very hesitant in submitting an offer with a waived inspection.
Right.
But if it's their second house, they have $500K in the bank, they bought a couple properties in the past to go out, we don't care about replacing the roof and the furnace in a couple years. I'm a little bit more comfortable with it in that.
Yeah, definitely. What about, speaking of the contingencies, let's go with an easy one, title contingency.
Yeah. Title contingency is interesting. I personally never had to terminate a contract based off of the title contingency itself, but it's funky. Y'all as buyers might not see this very often, but on our end, we read through a lot of what are called title reports. They're pulled together by the title company and shows everything that's recorded against the property. And in this conversation, probably the most important things we see are like easements. So if you were to be buying a home and one of your major criteria was to build a detached accessory dwelling unit in the backyard, turns out there's a PSE easement through the back half of your backyard and you can't even touch it, we would use the title contingency once we're under contract to say, hey, Mr. Seller, you have to either get rid of this PSE encroachment or we're walking away because we can't build our debt.
Right. They're not going to be able to get rid of the easement. So yeah, basically at that point, we have the option to walk away.
Yeah, and that's a pretty standard one we include in the
Yeah. And I think that that's really important too, when you said that is one of the things that we kind of focus on are those things. Some people, get worried about what about if they've got a, mortgage or a lien, or that all has to be taken care of at closing. So doesn't matter. You can ignore those. Actually, it's more usability of the property. Now, if you are having to waive contingencies, again, depending on what your use is. Now, if you do have a specific use like that, you're going to need to be able to review that. Or, CC&Rs, if there's, if you're running an auto shop and you might have 5 cars parked in your driveway, you're going to need to know if that's allowed. But outside of some of those special situations, I think as far as priority goes, it's probably one of the easier ones to waive because it is like you said, I'm not same position. I've never had to back out on one. So it's a low risk thing.
But it's considering the seller's responsible to deliver us, to get nerdy, marketable title at
right.
It covers 90% of bases.
Yeah.
That's the specific use case scenarios.
Yeah, definitely. And then really quickly, let's talk about escalation. Oh, sorry. Before we do that, let's talk about the financing contingency.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot we can do there. We included in financing as your appraisal contingency, which protects you in the event of a low appraisal. And of course, when you're competing and making competitive offers, there's a higher risk because you're escalating above. And, in a market that's shifting too, in spring markets where prices are going up quickly and the comps are 3 months old, you're definitely going to have higher risk of low appraisal.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on, let's just waive the appraisal?
Again, it goes back to your financial scenario. If we're VA 0% down, we can't cover it. So we're probably going to keep that appraisal contingency included. I do kind of wrap the financing and the appraisal contingencies in together because often they do go hand in hand. But generally, it would also depend on the quality of the lender, to go back to our first little.
Yes.
Point. If we were working with one of our preferred lenders and they had them pre-underwritten and we talked to the lender and said, hey, how are we looking waiving financing appraisal? And they said, looking pretty good.
And I want my buyer to have that conversation too, because you want them to know the risk. And I'm not a lender. I'm not a loan officer. So I don't actually have your full financial picture. I really don't know. I mean, I know what you tell me, but there might be things I don't see. So I also want the buyer to talk to the loan officer and understand all the risks that they have.
Good addition. They are a money person throughout. Any money questions, we go back to them.
Yeah.
But I would talk to them about it. And like you were saying, if we were escalating really high and we didn't have that money to cover, it's called like an appraisal gap. First of all, our offer might not get accepted. Just because the listing agent knows, like, hey, your offer, it might not appraise off price. If you don't have that money to cover it, we're probably going to take a cash offer or a lower financed offer.
Yeah. Or somebody who is then doing the next thing, which is waiving the appraisal or limited appraisal waiver, which I think the limited appraisal waiver is probably where a lot of people fit into, where if it's, if appraisal is low, you basically ahead of time offer to cover a certain amount. The nice thing about that is it's a calculated risk. It's not just wide open when you're waiving your appraisal fully, and you could be on the hook for $150,000. Hopefully not, but potentially. The limited, it just says we'll cover up to X amount, and if it's within that, then buyer just makes it up. Now, if it's over that, then buyer makes up that amount, and then the rest still has to be negotiated or is potential for the deal falling apart. What do you see limited appraisal waivers very often?
Not very often.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I've been kind of surprised you haven't been seeing them recently. If I expected to see them, I think it'd be right now. When, like you're saying, the market's picking up.
Yeah.
Comps from 3 months ago. Way more buyers in the active buyer pool right now.
Yeah.
But no, I haven't been seeing them very often recently.
I think one thing too, we'll talk about this in a minute, but with the love letters, but some of these things that I think that we did, especially when it was crazy during COVID, a lot of the stuff we did because the last few years with the rates haven't gone up, pretty slow. We just haven't had to do a lot of this kind of extreme offers like we have in the past, and that is one of them. Is the appraisal waivers. I haven't seen many of them, although I have been seeing a few more financing waivers. And really the difference there is just the risk and it. When you waive financing, you waive appraisal and everything else, but you could also waive financing and add the appraisal contingency back in too. So there's a lot of ways to structure that, and I think that's one thing where the relationship between your agent and the other agent makes a difference too, because you got to try to game out what risk you do need to put into it.
Yeah.
I don't want you to just risk everything if you're the only offer, but I also, if you're willing to do something, I don't want to say, oh, you don't need to, and then lose it. That's a important thing to keep in mind. What about earnest money deposits or earnest money amounts?
Yes. So earnest money, for those that don't know, is kind of like a security deposit on an apartment. It's us saying, like, as the buyers, hey, we are serious about buying this home. To show proof, we're going to put some skin in the game. Here's generally 3 to 5% of the purchase price that's going to be held by escrow. And then if we lock out and we don't have a contingency to protect us, you as the seller get to keep this money. A big part of our job as brokers is protecting that earnest money from going to the seller, which is why we include all these contingencies, really. So for me, if it's a competitive situation, 3 to 5% is pretty normal. I know people do go higher. In Washington, if it's a standard earnest money deposit, the seller can only keep up to 5%. So you can offer 10% earnest money. The seller only gets 5%, so it really doesn't do anyone any good. other than looking pretty on paper, I guess.
Yeah.
If it is a really competitive situation, 3 to 5% generally. If it's less competitive, I'll even go as low as 1%. Yeah, up to 3% is pretty normal. One big conversation we've been having recently is both releasing earnest money and making the earnest money a non-refundable deposit.
Right.
And there's both rabbit holes that we can go down. I've been seeing a lot of people releasing earnest money recently, which just means that instead of escrow holding the money, we'll give it directly to the seller, which doesn't release the seller from the obligation to return it if the buyer does terminate in a contingency. Whereas a non-refundable deposit is the exact opposite. Now it's the Wild West. You're going to give the seller a check for 5, 10, 15, 20%, and there's no legislative requirement for how much the seller can keep. So you give someone a check for 250 grand, that's a non-refundable earnest money deposit.
That's it.
That's it. You have no contingencies. You can walk away, but you're losing like 250 grand.
Yeah. And ideally, when you do that, one thing I think is important to note is that if you just release it and you don't add the caveat in there, say you put 200,000 down and release a non-refundable deposit, and the seller decides to back out, the seller gets to keep it. Unless you put in there an exception for seller default, which we have forms and language to do that, but it's not a default on the form that there is no default form for releasing earnest money and waiving, turn it into a deposit. So you need to make sure that your broker's on the ball. That's important, right? That's why it is important to be kind of a nerd in real estate, because you do have to know that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, if you put all this money in and you get a seller who's really greedy and they go, okay, we'll take your offer, and then we're going to get somebody else locked into a backup offer, and you didn't write it right, they can turn around the next day and cancel and be like, we're walking away with your money because you didn't put a caveat that we can't do this. And then they go to the next buyer who might be offering the same exact thing. I don't think anybody's going to do that over a few $1,000s, but when you start talking some of these properties, like you said, 100,000 is not uncommon. That's a lot of money to entice people to do shady stuff.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Let's see. Let's talk about, let's go to price, escalation clauses. Talk about how they work.
Totally. We mentioned this in the past episodes. We're coming in, hey, Mr. Seller, we will buy your house for $1 million. We want our offer to get accepted. So if you have another offer that comes higher than ours, we'll beat that offer by, for example, $10,000. No, that will pay more than $1.2 million. So you're setting yourself up to beat out other offers, but you're also giving yourself a hard ceiling. This is a really common strategy right now because we're in a busy market with lots of buyers, few listings. We're seeing probably just about every offer come in with escalation clauses.
It's pretty typical.
Very typical. Yeah. And we like them as buyers because it gives us a little bit of a hedge to get our offer accepted.
Right.
But sellers don't like them because there's a little bit of ambiguity and there's like a potential to try and contest some of the numbers, whether the math was done correctly. So oftentimes what we'll do, and we'll say, hey, we get you don't like the way this form is written. We get you don't like doing the math. Send us a counter offer with what our escalated price would have been. Tip the escalation clause out of the contract, and if everything's good to us, we'll sign the counter and buy it for what that escalated price would.
And show us the other offer. Yeah. Definitely always have to have the proof just to make sure. Yes. Yeah, I think that's it's important to prepare people for, because that is something that has kind of become more normal as the escalation clause, the actual form, has become more complicated. It's become more common to see agents. Yeah, let's just make this clear. And another reason too is, again, going back to appraisal. If somehow those documents get shuffled and that escalation isn't at the top, appraisers are looking to appraise it at the purchase price. And if they think the purchase price is the unescalated amount, a lot of times the appraisal will come in there and then realize, oh, we actually escalated 50 grand above. Now it's a whole different world of problems. So
I've seen cases where neither escrow or the lender look past the third page of the contract.
Yeah.
They just didn't scroll down to see the escalation on the last page. And 2 weeks in, whoopsie day.
A couple more really quick. Let's talk about buyer love letters. Writing letters to a seller, telling them why they love the home. From a buyer standpoint, I think they're great because there's no cost to it. There's no risk to it or anything like that. And we've got, I've got some great templates that I send my buyers, like basically just mimic this and plug in your information. And there's certain things, emotionally we know that connect buyers to sellers, sellers with buyers. What is your experience, or what are your thoughts on how effective they are?
I like it on the buy side, like you're saying. Anything we can do to try and give a bit of an emotional charge to our offer, try and build that human connection with the seller. Because at the end of the day, selling and buying homes is an incredibly emotional process. Right. And a lot of brokers forget that. So remaining empathetic and understanding like, hey, this is where the buyers are coming from. This is what they love about the house. This is why they'd love to live here. Please accept our offer. I don't see anything wrong with it. On the listing side, then, as the sellers, kind of the opposite approach. I often like to ask my sellers, like, hey, can I just rip love letters out, throw them away? I don't want you seeing them. I don't want their words affecting your decision. I want the purchase price and the terms to be what help you decide which offer to pick.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, very similar. As we talked about before, my strategy is usually let me withhold the love letters. Let's make a decision, make a logic-based decision. If you really feel like you need to read them after that, go ahead. But I think at least at that point, you've pretty well settled, seller is pretty well settled on what they want to do. And so it would be a really rare situation for the letter to affect them at that point. And frankly, most of my sellers are just like, yeah, there's no point in even needing to read them now. We've already made our decision. We don't even want it to affect us. But again, going back to it's such an easy thing. I think you want to do it just in case. I think there's a lot of agents who also don't take that strategy and they just include it and they can make a difference. I told you a story about my clients whose offer was accepted $25,000 lower than a competing offer because the letter was fantastic. And yes, that is absolutely one of the samples I send to my clients. That piece of paper is worth gold, but it's pretty rare that they're effective. And again, I think we don't even see it much anymore. It used to be really, really common. I think a lot of agents also worry about fair housing stuff. I don't think it's quite as risky as maybe some people are afraid of, but I think it is a legitimate concern, potentially anyways, and especially an emotional fraud type, where you're competitive. In fact, interestingly, there was talk of them banning them. Oregon did, and then it got overruled. So but yeah, I think it's something you do and hope it works. And if it doesn't, whatever, it didn't cost you anything. My next one is actually one of my favorite ones. I think it's one of the hardest things we deal with, but what do buyers do if they lose multiple bidding wars and they're just getting discouraged? I think going back to like what we do, we like to be nerds and stuff, but we also have to remember that there is the emotional side to it and it can feel exhausting. And for me anyways, the perspective I have to keep is that I just do this every day. So it's just another offer. Not that I don't care or anything like that, but the actual offer in that process is just another one. This is just what I do. I'm not the one losing the home. And so I have to keep in my mind that my clients are probably feeling down after losing 3 or 4, thinking they're never going to get a home. What strategies do you have to deal with that or to help your buyers deal with that?
Yeah, totally. So especially right now, we're seeing this a lot. I think the most important thing you can do to help mitigate this is by setting the right expectations. Whether you're the broker setting the expectations or you're the buyer doing it to yourself, come into it as disassociated as you can. Be like, hey, you know what? We really like this house, but I'm going to take a step back and try and remove my emotions as much as possible. Because there's
right.
I'll even tell buyers this throughout the purchasing process because deals fall apart fairly frequently.
Yeah.
Try and remain as objective as possible. Try not to fall in love. I don't want to see you get heartbroken. I understand there's still going to be emotions there, but do your best. So I think setting those expectations right up front is probably the best thing you can do.
Yeah.
And next, I always tell buyers there will always be more, better, prettier houses on the market. Whether it takes a month, 6 months, 2 years to find it, it will pop up.
Absolutely. I think that there is generally how I coach my folks through it. Like I've never had somebody who lost an offer and didn't still find a home they loved.
Yeah.
It's just never, again, knock on wood, it's never happened to me. I think that in that moment, it can feel really discouraging. But once you do find the right home, all that goes away. And like you said, you can't tell somebody how to, you can't get emotional over it because they are what they are, human. But I think, just kind of processing it and trying to take as logical of a view of it. And frankly, what actually does end up happening is the more offers you write, the better your offers get. You tend to get more comfortable with things and understand things. And so there are a lot of clients for whom, that's just part of the process. 1 year, I closed 50 transactions and I wrote 500 offers that year, which meant that on average, I was writing 10 offers per successful client. But that was just part of the process. And you learn that it becomes part of the process and, you just keep going. It's a competitive market. It's like anything else. If you want it, you just stick with it and do it till you win. Cool. Well, I think that's it for this one. Appreciate you joining me today and look forward to having you back.